fun of Ken, but Brian had to ruin that. So, so anyhow, I heard it told, and this may not be true. It's never true if somebody starts off with, I heard it told. But Ken went to go get a haircut, and he's wearing his University of Texas Longhorn shirt. And the barber goes, well, you must be a praying man. And Ken goes, well, I'm a pastor. And, because it's University of Texas. And the barber goes, well, I'm an atheist. And Ken's like, okay, that's fine. Just, cut what little hair I have left. See, I was going to make fun of him. And the barber's cutting Ken's hair, he goes, well, if you're a pastor, let me ask you a question. If God exists, why is there so much evil in the world? Ken goes, well, that's just a tough question. Gets done with the haircut and leaves. And as Ken's walking out the door, he sees a homeless feller with just long, raggy, unclean hair. He goes, why don't you come with me? Let's go inside. Ken looks at the barber and goes, hey, barber, I don't think barbers exist. Because if barbers exist, this feller wouldn't have long, unkept, raggy hair. Barber goes, problem isn't that I don't exist. He just never comes and sees me. So, kind of a cute joke, but also brings us into the idea of God's presence, something that we've been talking about a lot lately, right? And of course, in the New Testament, the new covenant, this new contract that Jesus signed, that Jeremiah talked about, that would be written on our hearts, God's presence is available to everybody. But back in Exodus, not quite. In fact, after the fall in Genesis, when heaven separated from earth, went away from Eden, and God locked Eden up with the cherubim, which we'll talk about a little bit more here. God was separated from the people, and he made that covenant with Abraham in Genesis 12. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those that curse you. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Well, that blessing is to be able to come into God's presence, right? Like, that's the secret right there. That's the big mystery. By the way, when Paul talks about mysteries made known, there you go. We're coming into God's presence. Now, let's also fast forward into the New Testament. Jesus says something kind of weird since we're talking about Moses. He said, for if you believe Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. Now, as I was pointing, Genesis is pretty easy. Like Genesis 3:15, the proto-evangelism passage, he will crush his head and he will strike his heel. We know that that's a messianic prophecy. Talks about the crucifixion. Okay, we can say that's about Jesus. But as I went through Exodus, I didn't find the word Jesus one time in there. In fact, I even looked in Hebrew. I didn't see Yeshua. I didn't see Ben Elohim, son of God. Ben Adam, son of man. I didn't see Jesus in there. So maybe as we look through it tonight, we will see if Moses spoke of Jesus. I don't know. Maybe. So, the second part, chapters 19 through 40, it's really about God's presence after Egypt, right? He's come, and we're going to maybe even start to understand why Paul loves the law so much, why Pharisees love the law so much. So, in the garden, Adam and Eve, they were in God's presence, but sin separated humans from God. Go Adam and Eve, thank you very much. But kind of like we talked about last week, that was a test, and we all failed the test. Only Jesus has passed the test, right? Everybody remember that? How to share the gospel? Okay. So we get God's promise to Abraham, and this promise gives access to God's presence. Now, where Exodus takes us is we're out of Egypt and we're at Sinai, and God's presence is there. Think really angry volcano. That's basically the description that we get that's going on at Sinai. And God invites the Israelites into this relationship, partnership, and the word we use for this is covenant. Some people call it the Mosaic covenant, some call it the Sinaitic covenant. Just take your choice. It doesn't really matter. And so the kind of key passage we want to look at out of 19 is verses 3 through 8. Moses went up to God. So notice, humans are being able to come into God's presence, right? And the Lord called him out of the mountain, saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob. That's a way of saying, hey, Jacob, he had the 12 tribes. When you say house of Jacob, you're saying, tell all the Israelites, right? That's fancy talk in the Bible. Tell all the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, reference the 10 plagues, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. This is a griffin eagle, not the bald eagle, so this is not any reference to America. Sorry, America's not in the Bible. But this is an eagle that lives in a very high mountain, kind of rocky area. There's a lot of symbolism going on to this eagle. It's actually worth just doing some additional research if you want to. And I brought you to myself. He's bringing them into his presence. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession. So this isn't like the covenant he made with Abraham where God just said, okay, I'm going to do everything. Like, you just got to, take an inch off, God's saying, you've got to do something and I'm going to do something. Now, there's a lot of discussion. Is this a permanent covenant or is this a temporary covenant? I'm not going to go into that. Sorry. But you shall be my treasured possession among all people, for the earth is mine. Let's keep a hold of that one. And you shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. Moses is like, all right, got it. I'll tell them that. So Moses called all the elders of the people, set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him, and the people all answered together, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And if I haven't told you this yet, the Israelites are liars, okay? Yes. And in fact, we're not there yet, but when we get to Deuteronomy, it's like in chapter 5, you're going to get the biggest eye roll from God when he gives his response to the people saying, all the Lord has commanded, we will do. You actually get to hear God's response. In fact, spoiler alert, here you go. God goes, oh, that they had such hearts as this always, to fear me and keep my commandments. You can just hear the sarcasm in God's voice when he says this. Oh, that they had such hearts. A lot of people think that the Bible is very literal and like, oh, the Israelites said, we'll keep his commandments. So they are horrible liars. And we're going to get to this when we talk about Aaron and the golden calf. Like, this dude is, wow. Either he was drinking something a little too spiked or he's a liar. Like, it's how the Bible is. It's real. It's in your face. It doesn't hold anything back. Now, so basically they agree, but they're supposed to go up into the mountain, but like I said, it's like this really angry volcano, and they're like, no, well, we're not going to do that. So they refuse to go into God's presence, so Moses and Aaron get to go into his presence. Like I said, it's basically a big, scary volcano. And we kind of lose sight of this. Like, thanks to Dante's Inferno, we paint hell as this picture of fire and Jonathan Edwards. As fire and brimstone and all the fires associated with the devil. But back here in Exodus, we see thunder, lightning, fire, all this associated with God. And what we forget is God has this cleansing, and we'll see it in the Psalms where he talks about, how fire refines the gold, it burns out the impurities, right? Like, that's God's holiness that he's talking about. And on this mountain at the very top, where God's presence has re-entered this tainted, sinful earth, he is burning away sin. That's basically what he's doing on top of this mountain. And as we continue going through these things, mountains are going to play a very big symbolism, both literally and metaphorically, about the presence of spirits to include God. But we'll cover that later in different books. But it's a picture that we do forget of God, of his burning holiness. It's so pure. And this is a good chapter to look at, to be reminded that he's not a wrathful God, but he is a holy God that cannot abide by sin, right? And yet, he is desiring to be in his people's presence so much that he is finding a way. And that's kind of what Exodus is about. And so we get to chapter 20, like how are they going to be in his presence? Well, we get the law, and this is why it becomes so important to the people of Israel. It's about being in God's presence. So anybody that's got the basic 10 Commandments memorized, no, they come out of Exodus 20. So we get the first 10 Commandments. And so if they obey God's laws, they'll become a holy nation, kind of like I read earlier. Now, the 10 Commandments, first 4 are about obeying God. Last 6 is how we should treat humans. There are some debates, like, are they all moral commands? Because within the first 4, there's remember the Sabbath day and keep it Sabbath. Is it a moral violation not to keep the Sabbath holy because Jesus is now our Sabbath? There's many, many debates over that, right? I mean, obviously killing somebody is immoral. That hasn't changed. That's one of the 10 Commandments. Just because they're old doesn't mean that they're not settled. Kind of one of those things. So they're not, I guess my point is, they're still worth studying. Now, where I personally stand, I've never read anything that said that the Sabbath has changed from Saturday. Now, I do believe that the Lord's Day is Sunday from the New Testament. That's the day that Jesus raised. In fact, we'll see that when we get to the laws that, like for Passover, the lamb is brought in on the 10th of Nisan and slaughtered on the 14th of Nisan. We'll see in the New Testament, Jesus rode in on the donkey on the 10th of Nisan and was crucified on the 14th of Nisan. Big parallelism going on there. And I don't think that we need to keep the Sabbath like the Jews do. Obviously, I don't. I ride in elevators all the time on Saturday when I possibly can. And I use electricity on Saturdays. So the Seventh-day Adventists probably wouldn't like me. But no, I believe Jesus fulfilled the Sabbath for me. I don't see it as a moral thing, right? Like I said, a lot of people still have a lot of debate over this. Do I think Sabbath, Shabbat in Hebrew means Saturday, is still Saturday? Yes, I do. Do I think Sunday is the Lord's Day? Yes, I do. Paul even says that. Why we argue about that? I think it's just we like to argue. So, but we go on, and then we're going to start getting into 53 more laws. Yes, there's a total of 613, but after the first 10 commandments, we get 53 more laws, and it starts off with altars. And this is really where everybody kind of starts to check out on their year into the Bible reading plan, because Genesis was pretty cool. We're reading about creation. We can start arguing, because again, everybody loves to argue. Is it a new earth that's 6,000 years old? Is it an old earth that's 4.7 billion years old? We get to learn about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's some cool stories about Joseph and the Real Housewives of Egypt. Just a lot of fun going on in Genesis. The first part of Exodus, like there's some really cool miracles with the 10 plagues and the Red Sea. We know these stories. Everybody kind of likes the 10 Commandments because pretty soon we get the golden calf. And now we're just bored because it's just a law book, right? But what I want to point out with the altars is this gets really important, because remember that quote from John that I started with? If you believed Moses, you would believe me. Now we're starting to get into something about understanding the Bible. So, the law of the altars. You shall not make gods, little g by the way, of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods, little g, of gold. An altar of earth you shall make for me, and sacrifices on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen, in every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. So you're going to use the earth to make altars, and God will have a presence with you. That's awesome. If you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stone. So just pick up a rock as it is, the way God made it. Don't chisel it. Now, why is this law important? Well, let's go back to Genesis, right? Like, there's a whole thing here. The Bible's always connected. All of creation is God's creation. That's basically what Genesis 1 just taught us. And God speaks everything into existence in 6 days. And God's presence fills all creation on the seventh day, the Sabbath, Saturday. And he rests. The tabernacle and the temple were built and dedicated in 7 speeches, which we haven't got to either the tabernacle or the temple yet. And so the priests or the kings could rest in God's presence. So we kind of see these repeating themes and patterns happening, right? Now, Genesis 2 kind of focuses on the land in Eden. Now, in the middle of Eden, God and humans live together. The temple is modeled after Eden. Now, the temple, I'm talking about Solomon's temple, by the way. And it's filled with images of flowers. The menorah, by the way, that's the tree of life that was right in the center of Eden. Now, of course, we know that Jesus is the true temple. And because of Jesus, God's presence dwells in all believers, right? You know, the Holy Spirit's within us. We are now the temple. There's a saint, you know, back to Abraham's promise, I'll be a blessing to all nations. Remember I said God's presence, that's the blessing. So we can see there's this whole theme going throughout the book, which will all eventually center around Jesus. But again, that's not what Jesus meant when he said Moses wrote him. So when we're building the altar out of non-hewn stone, it's because when God first started off, all of creation was his temple, right? So he's kind of going back to old school, going, well, if you're going to build an altar, you're going to build it out of my old temple, because we haven't built a tabernacle or temple yet. So he's getting ready to bring his presence in. Now, we get into some other laws. 21, it starts off with, highly controversial. It deals with slavery, right? Now, the Hebrew word is abed, which actually means servant. And it's probably more akin to indentured servitude, and there's this pattern that I want to set up that the laws are going to set up. It's a 6-in-1 pattern. We saw it with Genesis, the creation, 6 days of creation and 1 day of rest. With the servants, if you couldn't pay your debt to somebody, you're like, hey, Ken, sorry that I borrowed that $10. I can't pay it back. Looks like I owe you 6 years of servitude. Well, now if Ken's a horrible person, and we'll talk about what's called lex talionis, at the end of my 6 years, I'm free to go. The 7th year, I'm free. That's the law. Now, this was much better than the surrounding, Canaan, where, conquering nations, they just took slaves, and that was for life, right? It wasn't like the indentured servitude. Here, my debt's paid, I'm free to go. But now, if Ken's really cool, hey, you know what? You're a pretty cool master. I'm going to pierce my ear. That's what they meant by putting an owl through your ear. It's an ear piercing. And now I get to tell everybody, hey, I'm a servant. I'm a servant of Ken. And the idea is not to take shame in being a servant, because as we start to boast about being servants of the Lord, servants of Christ, we should be proud that we are not bonded in slavery to sin, but we are servants of the Lord Most High. This is also setting up that thing. But moving on from that, we get into social justice. That's also in chapters 21 through 22. And verse 16 starts with capital punishment, from anything from murdering to, just disobeying your parents. Sorry, Mom. But hey, we're under the New Testament, so that doesn't apply, so I was allowed to be a brat. Or to witchcraft, whatever you want. And again, this is where Leviticus will actually really hone in on lex talionis, which really is, it just means equal retribution, right? Eye for an eye, life for a life. Because think about this. If I walked up to Ron and I slapped him across the face, well, he's going to get mad. He's going to want to slap me twice. If I walked up to Brian and I knocked out a tooth, Brian's going to be like, well, Dave, you're going to drink through a straw because you're going to be toothless. None. That's the human heart. We cannot react equally. We have to take it up a notch. If you don't believe me, turn on the 6 o'clock news. But God knew this about our wicked heart, so he goes, look, man, if you knock out one person's tooth, they only get to take one of your teeth. That's called equal. If you kill one of theirs, they only get to kill one of yours. People are like, oh, well, capital punishment, that's so evil, that's murder, and the Bible says you can't murder. No, that's justice. There's a difference in the Bible between murder, and they actually use different words in Hebrew, and justice that takes a life. Basically, you have forfeit your life to live on God's earth when you break certain rules, and God's justice will be done. And there's some verses where God even says, if you take a human life, a human can take your life. He gives that justice in the Bible. Then we get into the laws about the festivals and the Sabbath. And but as we get there, it starts off with, for 6 years, there's that number 6 again, you shall sow your land and gather its yield, but on the 7th you shall let it rest and fallow. Now this is a little kind of just quick law verse that everybody doesn't pay attention to, but man, is this going to bite the Israelites in the rear keister hard, because for about 490 years they're going to work that land without letting it rest. They're not going to give it that 7 years rest like they're supposed to. And you know what the Lord High Most God's going to do? He's going to send them to Babylon for 70 years. Because do the math. If you take 490, divided it out by 7, you get 70. And he's going to let the land rest for 70 years. The Lord gets us in the end. That's the lesson of this passage. And we'll actually see that when we get to 2 Chronicles, because it's predicted by Jeremiah, and we'll see their exile into Babylon, which will bring us into Daniel, who's going to give us some really great messianic prophecies, like down pretty much to the day, which is pretty freaky. And then we get within these 3 festivals. It's Passover, which was in the very beginning of Exodus. It's the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then we get another one that we should be familiar with, Pentecost, right? And that's the only festival where they have leavened bread. Now, I want to read one of my favorite laws, because a lot of people do know this one, and they joke around about it. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Okay. Well, one of the reasons it's important to study this law is because when people read just a scripture by itself, they tend to make doctrine off of just a verse. And the Jews did this. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. All of the kosher law is based off of this one verse. If I was to eat a hamburger and then go drink some milk, the two would mix in my stomach, and I have now broken this law. How legalistic is that? Jesus said, you strain out a gnat, but you'll swallow a whole camel. This is what he's talking about, right? That's not what this verse means. And that's one of the reasons why I'm trying to take us up to this 30,000-foot view, is so that we get away from zooming in on verses and doing what's called proof texting. Well, if I read just this verse, obviously it means this. No, let's take a step back, because these are the laws about festivals and Sabbath, right? And right before that, the best of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. All right, so we're talking about Yahweh. Or let's see. Or let me start off. Sorry, that was mid-verse. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with anything leavened, or let the fat of my feast remain in the morning. So he's talking about specifically the Pentecost feast, right? Because we're talking about leavened bread. And then he says, the best of your first fruits of the ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. So now he's talking about bringing these first fruits into a holy area. And then he says, you shall not boil the goat of a young goat in its mother's milk, right? So this isn't a standalone verse. This is talking very specifically about when you're bringing the first fruits in during the Feast of the Leavened Bread, Pentecost, in the presence of the Lord on a holy space. Now, if you do a little bit of research, like with the god of El, which is different than like El Shaddai, but there's some language issues there, or like Baal, or out of Egypt, there was a pagan ceremony where you took a young goat, boiled in the milk of its mothers, put in some vegetables, did some incantations. Look at this, I'm doing witchcraft. He was saying, don't do witchcraft in my house with my festivals. Oh, well, that makes a lot of sense, because we just read the 10 Commandments. Don't have any other gods besides your God. When you build an altar, don't make gods out of silver and put them next to my altar. In context with this whole chapter, now it makes sense where he's saying, like, hey, when you're doing these festivals, don't do pagan practices at my festivals. Okay. That's what he's saying. There's a whole context to this. There's no need to proof text one verse. And that's kind of one of the points that I just wanted to drive to you of why we want to zoom out sometimes. Let's see. I didn't see what time we started or how late we were, so. All right. So now chapters 25 through 31. These are awesome chapters. They are 7 chapters on how to build the tabernacle that nobody ever reads. Now notice I said 7 chapters on how to build the tabernacle. How many days did it take to build earth? Technically 7. God took a rest. 7 chapters, 7 days of creation. This is actually a thing. And we're going to nail this one down. So, the tabernacle. I want to jump into Hebrews real quick. And this is Hebrews chapter 8, verse 5. And this is my point. The tabernacle is heaven on earth. And you might think, well, Dave, maybe you're drinking the same thing that Aaron drank when he thought that the calf jumped out of the fire. No. In Hebrews 8, verse 5, it says, they served, and it's talking about the Levitical priests, they served a copy and a shadow of heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, the tabernacle, he was instructed by God, saying, see that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown to you on the mountain. Get that? They were shown a copy of the shadow of heavenly things. Now, if you really want to have some fun with this, jump to Revelation 4, verse 6. And before the throne, there was something like a sea of glass. We call these lavers, those big basins for washing. Well, you didn't have to wash anymore. That's why it turned to a sea of glass, like crystal. And in the center of the throne were 4 living creatures. What was on top of the ark? 2 cherubim, right? This copy of a shadow, you start to see what was in the tabernacle. John is describing in Revelation verse 4. The menorah, the tree of life that was in Eden, the flowery designs, all of this. Eden, that was heaven on earth, that was separated and knocked off or guarded by a cherubim with a flaming sword, that we don't get much description of, 2 chapters. There's 50 chapters describing the tabernacle. That's a copy and a shadow of heaven. Where does everybody want to go when they die? Why aren't we reading this stuff? Oh, because it's boring, because it's the law. No, this is God telling us what heaven is. And a lot of us want to jump past this. And more than that, I kind of started off with that quote of Jesus. If you didn't believe Moses, you won't believe me, because Moses wrote of me. Well, we're getting to that. And, when we look at the tabernacle, the entrance was always on the east side. I don't know if people knew this. Do you guys, anybody actually ever studied the layout and know which tribe guarded the entrance? Judah. You had to go through Judah. What tribe was Jesus from? How many entrances were there to the tabernacle? Just one. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. Once you went into the tabernacle, the only way to atone for the sin is God said, I will see them through the blood. You had to slaughter a goat or a lamb to enter into the tabernacle. Jesus is our final sacrifice. Are we starting to see something here? And in fact, the Word became flesh and tabernacled with us. Didn't dwell with us, didn't come into presence with us. John says the Word became flesh and tabernacled with us. Now, when we look at how the Israelites laid out, they laid out a giant encampment with the tabernacle in the center, and in the center of the tabernacle was God's presence. Once Jesus came, his presence is in the center of us. When Jesus said, Moses wrote of me, he's talking about the tabernacle. Now, there's other portions that he does talk about Jesus as well. But the tabernacle is a direct reference into heaven, both heaven and to Jesus. And when people want to skip over like these 7 chapters of the tabernacle, which, by the way, we do end up getting into chapter 32 where Moses goes up onto the mountain. The Israelites are, this is the big uh-oh chapter, right? Like, uh-oh. Hey, we've seen God send 10 plagues. We've seen God split the Red Sea. Moses has been gone for like an hour. So we're bored. Hey, Aaron, go ahead and make us some gods to worship. And Aaron's like, hey, just give me your gold. I'm going to chisel it out. That's what the Bible says. So first verse, Aaron, chisels out the idols. God tells Moses, like, your people have done messed up. Moses goes down, gets mad, throws some stones around. He asks Aaron, he's like, hey, what happened? And Aaron starts off by telling the truth. Well, the people were bored. They didn't know where you went. And I was like, give me your gold. And, of course, Aaron makes it sound like he's just going to throw the gold into the fire to get rid of it so the people can't do anything bad. And then out jumps a calf, right? Like, again, they're liars. But this is what I want us to get out of this. And this is probably something we don't think about with God. And the Lord said to Moses, go down, for your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I have commanded them, and have made for themselves a golden calf, and they have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen these people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you. God was going to kill all the Israelites and start over with Moses. Moses pleads with God to spare them, but Moses implored the Lord his God and said, O Lord, what does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out to kill them? Right? So Moses kind of talks with God. Why is this conversation in there? We actually get to see God's grief. That's what it is. This conversation brings us into God's experience of grief and pain due to Israel's actions. Even though God can walk away from his covenant at this point with Israel, he chooses faithfulness to his own promise. And it's through it, even though it's going to cost him, right? It's going to cost him Jesus. Now, of course, Moses isn't much kinder to the Israelites. He has the Israelites kill a bunch of people, so that's fun. Hey, I thought seminary was hard with writing research papers. The Levites had to kill a bunch of people to get ordained. Much tougher situation. Moses, it says in Exodus 32:20, he took the calf that they had made with fire, ground it to powder, and scattered it in the water and made the people of Israel drink it. Like, sometimes there's a little humor in the Bible, so, and I guess Aaron was burping up the powdered gold dust as he's like, jumped out of the fire. 34:6-7 is a great verse if you want to see God describe his character for the first time. And this is when it's talking about the Shekinah glory. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the father on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. It's the first time we really ever get a description of God's character in the Bible. We're followed by 6 more chapters of just basically Moses building the tabernacle. And then the book ends with the tabernacle's built, and it's like the first season finale with a cliffhanger, right? Moses was actually a pretty good writer. He can't enter the tabernacle. It's built. God's presence comes into it, and it says Moses can't enter. It's like, oh, well, what happened? And it leaves the reader wondering, will Israel ever be able to fix a relationship and go into God's presence? That's kind of why the book ends that way. This book opened with Pharaoh's evil threatening of God's covenant promise, but now the book ends with Israel as their own worst enemy. So it's not a finished book, and that's kind of the way Moses wrote it. Their own sin has threatened their covenant. How will God reconcile his holiness and goodness and bring his presence into the corruption of a sinful people? To answer this question is the law, and that's why Paul loved the law. Now, the way I'm going to conclude this is we saw Aaron just fumble, right? Like he got caught. Like he saw all these great things that God did. He saw the plagues. He saw the Red Sea. He saw God's presence. And given a couple seconds, he just, okay, well, I'm going to do my own thing. And the question I would ask you is, for anybody that has seen or felt or been around God's presence, what are you doing about that? Are you just sitting there like whenever it's possible to make your own false gods out of your time, such as watching TV, quilting, doing whatever? Or are you taking your time to disciple or to use it in a way in the new covenant that God would want you to? I actually had a much better ending for that to relate to Aaron's stupidity, but I forgot it and I didn't write it down, so that was my stupidity. It was going to be beautiful, and man, dang. But basically, it comes down to that. We do see in this book of Exodus, after Egypt, Aaron did make a big mistake, right? God grieved, but he didn't take Aaron away from his role of high priest. In fact, every high priest was still a descendant of Aaron. God's character even says he's willing to forgive sin. I think this is a good book to bring forward to start to see where we're going. It's going to bring us into the law to answer that question of how did the Israelites come into God's presence, and where did the law serve that? Jesus said, I came to fulfill the law. This is about making sure that everybody can come into God's, or that everybody can receive God's presence, right? Having the Holy Spirit within us, being sealed for salvation. And that's just kind of the beginning of where the Bible's taken us. And of course, next we're going to get into Leviticus, everybody's favorite, but there's actually a lot of fun stories in Leviticus. We'll go into Numbers after that, which Numbers just has a bad name. In Hebrew, it actually means into the wilderness. So, we'll just call it Into the Wilderness, much better name. So, other than that, we'll finish up with a few prayers, and I hope you guys enjoyed Exodus.